The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone, from the judge to the lawyers to the audience, was holding their breath. Standing at the witness box was a small, 10-year-old girl named Hannah Green. She had blonde curls that bounced nervously with every slight movement, and her eyes, wide and innocent, scanned the room. Her hands gripped a crumpled piece of paper tightly. Judge Michael Hartman, a man known for his unwavering control and stern demeanor, stared at Hannah in disbelief. His once imposing face had gone pale. He wasn't the only one. Prosecutor Samuel Clark, who had been smugly confident all morning, suddenly shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The jury, previously uninterested in the proceedings, leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the girl. Even David Green, Hannah's father, sitting in the defendant's chair, was unable to tear his gaze away. He sat frozen, a mix of love, confusion, and fear in his eyes as he looked at his daughter. I have proof," Hannah said softly, but her voice cut through the silence like a bell. Her tiny hands shook as she unfolded the piece of paper, holding it up for the court to see. David's breath hitched in his chest. He knew what was coming. He knew what his daughter was about to do, and his heart swelled with a bittersweet sense of hope and terror. He had always told her the truth, but he hadn't prepared her for this moment. Judge Hartman's voice cracked as he spoke, trying to maintain his authority. "What do you mean, young lady?" he asked, his usual confidence lost. His eyes searched her face for an answer, one he hoped wouldn't shatter everything. Hannah hesitated, glancing at her father for a brief moment before turning back to the judge. "I know the truth, and if you let me speak, I can prove that my daddy didn't do it." The entire courtroom gasped in unison. Judge Hartman's face turned an even deeper shade of pale. The prosecutor seemed taken aback for the first time. The jury, once bored with the case, now sat on the edge of their seats. Everyone was riveted by the words of a 10-year-old girl. 3 months earlier, Hannah Green had been just like any other child, innocent, carefree, with a love for drawing, riding her bike, and spending time with her father. David Green, her dad, was her hero. Every night before bed, he would tuck her in, kiss her forehead, and whisper, "I'll always protect you, kiddo." But everything changed one Saturday morning, the day the police arrived at their door. It was just after breakfast when Hannah heard the loud banging on the front door. Her father, David, got up from the table to answer it. No sooner had he opened the door than 2 officers in dark uniforms stormed in. "David Green, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," one officer announced, grabbing his arms and twisting them behind his back. "What? No, wait!" David's voice was filled with confusion and shock. "I haven't done anything." Hannah jumped from her chair in a panic, spilling her cereal across the floor. "Daddy, what's happening?" she cried. The officers didn't respond. They were already rushing into the house, flipping over cushions, searching through drawers, ignoring Hannah's frantic questions. David struggled against them, his face twisted with frustration. "You've got the wrong guy! I swear I didn't do this!" he shouted. One of the officers grumbled, "Tell it to the judge," as they snapped handcuffs around his wrists. "Daddy, no!" Hannah screamed, running toward him, grabbing onto his arm. "What's happening?" David knelt down, his eyes full of pain as he looked at his daughter. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling, "listen to me. No matter what happens, you need to be strong, okay?" Tears welled up in Hannah's eyes, and she shook her head, trying to understand. "I don't understand, Daddy." Before he could say another word, the officers yanked him away, dragging him out the door. And just like that, Hannah's world shattered. The next few weeks were a blur for Hannah. Her mother, Laura Green, tried her best to stay strong, but every night Hannah would hear her crying in their bedroom. The news painted David as a criminal, someone who had stolen millions of dollars from his company. People whispered about them at the grocery store and at school. Hannah's classmates avoided her. But through it all, Hannah knew one thing for certain. Her dad wasn't a bad man. He had always been kind, honest, and had taught her to do the right thing, no matter what. Someone was lying, and Hannah was determined to figure out who. She began paying close attention whenever her mom spoke to their lawyer. She listened intently when they visited her dad in jail. She took mental notes of everything she could remember from the day of his arrest. But then, one evening, as she sifted through old paperwork in her father's office, she stumbled upon something strange, something that could change everything. A letter, folded neatly and tucked between old tax documents. The paper was slightly crumpled, and the ink was fading, but the words were clear. And as Hannah read them, her heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst. The letter proved that her father was innocent. She had to show it to someone, but who could she trust? Her mother? No, she was too emotional to think clearly. The lawyer? Maybe, but what if he didn't believe her? Hannah's mind raced. She knew what she had to do. She was going to take the letter to court. As she stood before the judge now, holding the letter tightly in her trembling hands, Hannah took a deep breath. "I have proof," she repeated, her voice shaky but determined. Judge Hartman's pale face twitched as he leaned forward. "Go on," he urged, his voice barely a whisper. And with that, Hannah began reading the letter aloud, unaware of how this small piece of paper would unravel everything and change the course of the trial forever. The morning was quiet, too quiet for a Saturday. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, the sound of her spoon clinking against her cereal bowl filling the silence. It was just a regular morning, just like any other. She had woken up early, excited for a day of drawing and playing outside. The sun was streaming through the window, and the house smelled like pancakes and fresh coffee. Life had been peaceful before everything changed. But then, the knocks on the door began. Loud, insistent, and urgent. They echoed through the small house, shattering the calm. Hannah's heart skipped a beat as she heard her father's footsteps move toward the front door. She knew that knock. It wasn't the kind of knock that meant a friendly neighbor or a package delivery. Something was wrong. Hannah's father, David Green, opened the door, his face filled with a mix of confusion and concern. No sooner had the door swung open than two officers in dark uniforms barged past him, pushing their way inside without a word. Hannah froze, cereal spilling from her spoon into her lap, as she watched in shock. "David Green, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," one officer announced, grabbing David's arm and twisting it behind his back. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. David's eyes widened with disbelief. "What? No, this is a mistake. I haven't done anything," he protested, trying to pull away. But the officers were too strong, their grip like iron around his wrists. They didn't listen. They didn't care. They were here for one thing only: to take him away. The second officer, a tall man with a cold expression, shoved past David and into the living room, flipping over cushions and rifling through drawers. David struggled in their grip, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. "You've got the wrong guy. I swear to God, I haven't done anything," he yelled. His voice cracked with the desperation of a man who knew he was being wrongly accused, but it was all falling on deaf ears. Hannah stood frozen at the kitchen table, unable to move. Her father's words barely registered in her mind. She just kept staring at him. Her father, the man she trusted, the one who had always taken care of her. How could they do this? Why were they doing this? Before she could take another step, the officers were already leading David out the door, his hands cuffed behind his back. "No!" Hannah screamed, rushing forward. She reached out for him, her small hands grasping at his arm, but one of the officers shoved her away, making her stumble. "Hannah, listen to me," David said, his voice soft but firm. He knelt down in front of her, locking eyes with her. There was pain in his gaze, but also love, deep and unwavering. "Sweetheart, you need to be strong, okay? No matter what happens, don't let them break you. I'll be okay." Tears welled up in Hannah's eyes as she shook her head, not understanding what was happening, not understanding why her father was being taken away. "I don't understand, Daddy. What's going on?" David paused for a moment, his face filled with anguish, and then he was pulled away by the officers. He didn't get a chance to answer. Hannah watched, her heart shattering, as they dragged him out the door and into the back of a police car. And just like that, her entire world seemed to unravel. Her hero, her father, was gone. In the following days, Hannah's life was turned upside down. The news was everywhere, spreading like wildfire. Reporters were all over the place, calling her mother, calling their family. Her classmates at school avoided her, no longer speaking to her, as if her father's arrest was somehow her fault. At the grocery store, she overheard people whispering about her father, calling him a criminal, a thief, and a liar. They painted him as a man who had stolen millions from his own company, and no one seemed to care that there was no proof. Everyone had already made up their minds, but Hannah knew better. She knew her father was innocent. He couldn't be guilty. He was kind and honest. He had always taught her to do the right thing, no matter what. He had always kept his promises, especially the one he had made to her. "I'll always protect you." Now, she had to protect him. Hannah overheard her mother, Laura Green, talking to their lawyer one evening. Her voice was low and filled with worry, but Hannah caught a few snippets of the conversation. "There's no evidence," Laura was saying. "He's been framed. But how do we prove it? We don't have anything to show it." That was when it hit her. If they didn't have anything, then it was up to Hannah to find something. She couldn't let her father take the fall for something he didn't do. He had always told her that the truth was the most important thing, and if she could uncover it, she had to. She wasn't just going to sit back and let him rot in jail. Hannah spent the next few days listening carefully to every conversation she could overhear. She paid attention when her mother spoke to their lawyer. She remembered every detail she could about the night her father was arrested, trying to find any small piece of information that could help him. And then, one evening, while going through some old papers in her father's office, she found it. It wasn't much, just a letter, folded and hidden among some old tax documents. It was slightly crumpled, the ink faded in some spots, but the words were still clear. Hannah held the letter up, her heart pounding in her chest as she read it. The letter revealed that her father had been set up, that someone else had orchestrated the crime and framed him for it. For a moment, Hannah stood frozen, staring at the words on the page. She knew what this meant. This letter could clear her father's name. But who could she trust to help her now? She thought about her mother. No, she was too distraught to see the truth. The lawyer? Maybe. But what if he didn't believe her? She could take it to the police. But who would listen to a 10-year-old girl? That's when Hannah made up her mind. She was going to take this letter to court. She was going to prove that her father was innocent and expose the real criminal. As she tucked the letter into her pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, and that the journey ahead would be far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The weeks that followed were a blur of confusion, pain, and uncertainty. For Hannah Green, life had changed so drastically that it felt like a different world. What had once been a routine existence, a life filled with school, friends, and weekends spent with her dad, was now consumed by the shadows of scandal and fear. Her mother, Laura Green, did her best to keep things normal, but it was clear to anyone who looked that she was barely holding it together. When they went to visit David Green in jail, Laura tried to put on a brave face, but Hannah could hear the quiet sobs each night, muffled by the closed bedroom door. Every time her mother spoke on the phone with their lawyer, her voice trembled. She was trying so hard to stay strong, but it was clear. She didn't know how to fight this. The media had made a circus out of David's arrest. Reporters camped outside their house, their cameras flashing as they tried to catch a glimpse of the accused criminal's family. At school, Hannah's classmates no longer spoke to her. Their whispers followed her through the hallways, and the few friends who remained distant avoided her at lunch. One day, Samantha, the girl who had once been her best friend, asked if she was okay. But when Hannah answered with a hesitant, "I'm fine," Samantha quickly looked away, clearly uncomfortable. The whispers that filled the air didn't match the father Hannah knew. They said her father was guilty of stealing millions from his company, GreenTech Industries, but Hannah knew that wasn't true. She had seen him too many times, after a long day at work, coming home to kiss her forehead and promise that everything would be okay. He wasn't the man they said he was. Hannah's faith in her father was unwavering. She couldn't just accept what the world had decided, not without knowing the truth. Her dad had always told her that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. And if her dad was innocent, she would prove it. For days, she focused on that single goal, finding the truth. But finding answers wasn't as simple as she had hoped. The first breakthrough came one afternoon when Hannah overheard her mother speaking to Robert Daniels, the family lawyer. Laura's voice was shaky, and Hannah could hear the frustration in her words. "They've already convicted him in the press," Laura was saying. "How are we going to fight this? They say he's stolen millions, but where's the evidence? It's all just hearsay." Robert's response was grim. "We don't have much to go on right now, Laura. The case is stacked against him. Unless we can find something concrete, something real, there's not much we can do." "Anything, Robert," Laura replied desperately. "Anything that can help us prove David didn't do this." The conversation ended, and Hannah's thoughts raced. She couldn't let this be the end. Her mother was right. Without hard evidence, there was no way to convince anyone of the truth. But she had to find it. The next day, after school, Hannah went to her father's office. She had been there countless times before, sitting in the corner while he worked, watching him organize papers, balance books, and make calls. It was one of the places where she felt closest to him. It was his domain, his place of work, and if there was any chance to find something that could help him, it would be there. She rummaged through the drawers, flipping through old files, looking for something, anything, that would tell her the truth. It was then, hidden among some old tax documents, that she found it. A folded letter, slightly crumpled, its ink faded but still legible. She could hardly believe her eyes. The letter was addressed to her father. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a simple piece of correspondence, but as she read, her heart pounded faster and faster. The letter was a threat, an ominous warning to David, telling him to keep quiet about the missing funds, or else he would be the one blamed for everything. The letter read, "David, this is the only warning you'll get. keep your mouth shut about the missing funds, or you'll take the fall for all of it. You were never meant to find out the truth. If you push any further, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose everything. The documents, the signatures, the right people in the right places. No one will believe you. Walk away now, or watch your world burn. Hannah stood frozen, clutching the letter in her hands. Her mind raced. This was it. This was the proof that her father had been set up. Someone had framed him. But who? And why? Her first instinct was to show the letter to her mother, but when she thought about it, she hesitated. Laura was too emotional, too distraught. She wouldn't be able to see it for what it was. She'd only panic. No, this letter needed to be taken to someone who could help, someone who would know what to do with it. But who could she trust? There was no time to waste. Hannah needed to act fast. She made up her mind. She would take the letter to court. She had no idea how or when, but she was going to prove her father's innocence, no matter what it took. The problem, though, was that she couldn't do this alone. The only person who could help her was Leo Parker, her best friend. Leo was brilliant, too smart for his own good, some might say. He was a tech genius, capable of hacking into systems, solving complex problems, and thinking on his feet. If anyone could help her prove her father's innocence, it was him. After school the next day, she met Leo at their usual spot, the old basketball court near their school. Leo was already there, his laptop open in front of him as he typed furiously. "Leo," Hannah said breathlessly as she approached. "I need your help." Leo looked up, eyebrows raised. "What's up, Green?" Hannah hesitated for a moment before she spoke. "I need you to help me find out who really did this. Who framed my dad?" Leo's expression softened. "What happened?" As Hannah explained the situation, Leo's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping on the laptop's keyboard. "You found something big, didn't you?" Hannah nodded. "A letter. It says someone else set him up. But I need to prove it." Leo closed his laptop with a determined look. "Okay, I'm in." Together, they made a plan. They would dig deeper into the company GreenTech Industries, where Hannah's father had worked. They would find the truth, no matter what. The next day, they began their search. It wasn't going to be easy, but Hannah knew one thing for sure. She couldn't give up. Not when the truth was within her reach. The courtroom buzzed with a strange energy, an undercurrent of tension that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Hannah Green stood at the witness stand, her small frame trembling as she clutched the crumpled letter in her hands. The eyes of everyone in the room were fixed on her, on the little girl who had just declared that she had the proof to set her father, David Green, free. Judge Michael Hartman stared at Hannah, his pale face tight with uncertainty. The usual stoic expression he wore as a judge was replaced by one of disbelief. The courtroom was silent, as if time itself had paused. Prosecutor Samuel Clark, who had been so confident just moments before, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His previous smirk was gone, replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Even the jury, who had once appeared completely disengaged, now sat on the edge of their seats, eyes locked on the young girl. Hannah was acutely aware of every pair of eyes on her. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, feel the cold sweat beginning to form on her palms as she gripped the letter. She had never been this scared in her life, but her resolve was unshakable. She had to do this. For her dad. "Go on, young lady," Judge Hartman finally managed to say, his voice tight. There was a flicker of fear in his eyes, though he tried to mask it with authority. He was looking at the letter in Hannah's hands, his gaze lingering on it, as if trying to figure out how something so simple could have so much power. Hannah took a deep breath, unfolding the letter carefully. making sure it didn't tear. Her hands shook, but she focused on the words. She knew what they meant, what they represented. This letter was everything. It was the truth. She began to read aloud, her voice quiet at first, but growing in strength with each word. David, this is the only warning you'll get. Keep your mouth shut about the missing funds, or you'll take the fall for all of it. You were never meant to find out the truth. If you push any further, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose everything. The documents, the signatures, the right people in the right places. No one will believe you. Walk away now, or watch your world burn. As Hannah finished reading, there was a collective gasp in the courtroom. It was as though everyone had been holding their breath, and now they were exhaling in shock. Judge Hartman looked as if he had seen a ghost. His hands, which had been firmly gripping the bench moments before, were now trembling. He wiped his brow, trying to steady himself, but the change in his expression was undeniable. The prosecutor, Samuel Clark, shot to his feet with an angry outburst. "That letter is irrelevant," Clark barked, his face turning bright red with frustration. "This is nothing more than a child's desperate attempt to save her father." But before Clark could continue his rant, Judge Hartman silenced him with a raised hand. His voice was shaky, but he spoke firmly, though there was a hint of fear in it. "Let her finish," he ordered. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest. She had barely started reading the letter. She hadn't even gotten to the part that would change everything. She continued, her voice faltering slightly, but she pushed through. The letter was about to reveal more than just an accusation. It was about to expose the entire conspiracy. She took a deep breath and read on. "David, if you keep digging into this, you'll lose everything we've built. The signatures, the documents, the people involved. They're too powerful. No one will believe you. Walk away from this now, or your career, your life, will be over." As she read the final lines, a chill swept through the courtroom. For a brief moment, no one moved. The room was as silent as the grave. Hannah could feel the weight of the words settling on her shoulders, the enormity of the situation crashing down around her. The defense lawyer, Robert Daniels, jumped to his feet, his voice rising with excitement. "Your Honor, this is proof. This letter shows that my client, David Green, has been framed. He's been set up by someone with power, someone within GreenTech Industries. We can prove this. We need to investigate further." The prosecutor, however, was not so easily deterred. "Objection!" Clark shouted. "This letter is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a child to fabricate evidence. How do we know it's real? How do we know it wasn't written by this girl herself?" Hannah felt her heart drop. Her worst fear had come true. Clark was trying to discredit the letter, trying to make her look like a liar. But she wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let them take this away from her father. Judge Hartman, looking even more unnerved than before, turned to Hannah. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Where did you find this letter, young lady?" Hannah's hands were shaking, but she knew she had to answer truthfully. "I found it in my dad's office," she said, meeting the judge's gaze. "It was hidden under some old papers. I didn't write it. I swear, someone else wrote it. They were trying to scare my dad." Clark sneered. "How convenient. A 10-year-old girl conveniently finds a letter that could absolve her father. What a surprise." But as Clark opened his mouth to speak again, Robert Daniels cut him off. "Your Honor," he said urgently, "the letter is real. We need to investigate its authenticity. If it's true, then my client was framed. Someone is trying to cover up the truth." For the first time in the trial, Judge Hartman seemed unsure of himself. He looked at the letter again, his expression tense. His fingers trembled slightly as he placed the paper on the desk before him. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Hartman cleared his throat. "We will take a short recess," he announced, his voice strained. The gavel slammed against the wood. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Hannah turned to look at her father, who was still sitting in the defendant's chair. His face was pale, his expression a mix of hope and fear. His lawyer, Robert, leaned in to whisper something urgent in his ear. The prosecutor, Samuel Clark, was standing at the back, fuming, but even he couldn't hide his unease. Hannah's mind raced. Something was wrong. The way Judge Hartman had reacted, he wasn't just surprised, he was terrified. But why? What did this letter mean? And why was the judge so shaken? The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the recess dragged on. For Hannah Green, every minute felt like an eternity. She sat next to her mother, who had her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her knuckles white with the pressure. Hannah couldn't focus on anything except the letter, the words that had seemed to come from nowhere, but now held the power to change everything. She kept replaying Judge Hartman's reaction in her mind, his pale face, the trembling of his hands, the way he seemed almost frightened. What was it about that letter that had shaken him so deeply? Was there something he knew about the people involved in the conspiracy? Something more than just what was written on that paper? Hannah's mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle, but it was difficult. She didn't have all the answers yet. All she had was the letter that had already sent shockwaves through the courtroom. And now, with the recess finally over, the real battle was just beginning. As the gavel came down and the judge returned to his seat, the courtroom grew eerily quiet. The murmurs that had filled the air moments before ceased at once. Everyone was waiting for Judge Hartman's next move. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice still shaky. "We will continue," he said, looking at the letter once again. "But we need to investigate the authenticity of this letter. Who wrote it? How did it end up in the defendant's office? We need to find answers. This case cannot move forward until we know the truth." Hannah felt a surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The letter had made the judge question everything, and that meant the case wasn't over. It meant there was a chance. A real chance. The prosecutor, Samuel Clark, looked livid. His face had turned a deep shade of red as he tried to keep his cool. "This is just a distraction," he muttered, his voice low but full of venom. "A child's wild accusation. There's no evidence to support this letter." But Judge Hartman wasn't listening to him. He motioned for the bailiff to call a short break while the letter's authenticity was verified. As the courtroom emptied out, Hannah leaned in close to her mother. "Mom, something's not right," she whispered urgently. "The judge, he knows something. I can feel it." Laura looked at her daughter, her face full of concern. "Hannah, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. "What do you mean?" "The way the judge reacted," Hannah said. "He wasn't just surprised. He was scared. I think he knows something about this whole thing that he's not telling us." Her mother frowned, looking around the courtroom, clearly unsure of what to make of her daughter's words. "You're just stressed, honey. We all are. Let's just wait and see what happens." But Hannah knew in her gut that there was more going on here than anyone realized. The letter had uncovered something much bigger than anyone had imagined. But who was involved? And what would happen next? A few hours later, the courtroom reconvened, and Judge Hartman returned to his seat, his face drawn and pale. He had been briefed about the results of the investigation into the letter's authenticity, but Hannah could see the unease still lingering in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that the letter you've seen today is, in fact, genuine," Judge Hartman announced, his voice shaking slightly. "We have verified that the handwriting matches that of an individual within GreenTech Industries, the company in question. The signatures on the letter, as well as the contents, align with the evidence we've found." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. David Green's lawyer, Robert Daniels, stood up, a look of triumph on his face. "Your Honor, this is it. This letter is proof that my client was set up. Someone within GreenTech is trying to cover up a massive fraud scheme, and my client was framed." The prosecutor, Samuel Clark, was still reeling from the blow. He tried to regain his composure, but the evidence against his case was mounting by the minute. "Objection!" he snapped. "This letter doesn't prove anything. It's still just a piece of paper. We don't have enough to implicate anyone." But Judge Hartman was no longer looking at Clark. His attention was fixed on the defense team, and his face had become a mask of solemn understanding. "We will allow further investigation into these claims," he said quietly. "The case will continue, but I expect full cooperation from all parties involved. If there is any truth to these accusations, we need to find it." Hannah's heart soared as she watched the events unfold. The tide was turning in her favor. But even with the letter's authenticity confirmed, there was still so much more to uncover. Who in GreenTech was behind the fraud? Who was trying to frame her father? In the days that followed, things began to move quickly. Hannah's family lawyer, Robert Daniels, worked tirelessly to uncover the next piece of the puzzle. And while the evidence kept pointing to corruption within GreenTech, there was still no clear link to the person orchestrating it all. Hannah knew that she had to find the answers herself. She spent hours scouring through the company's financial records, but nothing stood out. Nothing that could directly tie the fraud to someone powerful within the company. It wasn't until one night, after a long search through her father's office, that she found the name she had been looking for: Matthew Langley. Langley was a senior executive at GreenTech, someone her father had mentioned in passing on occasion. He was the man responsible for managing the company's finances. The letter, Hannah realized, had been written by someone close to her father, someone in a position of power at GreenTech, who had a vested interest in covering up the truth. Hannah had her first clue, but it was only the beginning. Now, it was time for her to get serious. Hannah's mind raced as she stared at the name Matthew Langley on the page before her. It was like a key that unlocked the next chapter in the mystery surrounding her father's arrest. Langley was a senior executive at GreenTech Industries, the company that had accused her father of fraud. He was the one who had access to all the financial records, the one who had the power to cover up any wrongdoing. Hannah had a gut feeling that he was at the center of it all, the mastermind behind the entire scheme to frame her father. The letter had confirmed what she already suspected. Someone within GreenTech had set her father up, and Langley's name kept popping up in all the wrong places. But knowing that Langley was involved wasn't enough. Hannah needed proof. Concrete, irrefutable proof that would tie him to the fraud and to the conspiracy to destroy her father's life. She couldn't waste any more time. There was only one way to get the answers she needed. She had to break into Langley's office and find the evidence herself. The plan was risky, but Hannah wasn't going to back down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. She knew she couldn't do it alone, so she called her best friend, Leo Parker. Leo was a tech genius, a boy who could hack into systems, crack passwords, and solve problems that most adults couldn't even begin to understand. He was the only person who could help her get into Langley's office. If they could find the files hidden away in his computer, or any documents that proved Langley's involvement in the fraud, they could finally expose him for what he really was, a criminal. The next afternoon, after school, Leo met Hannah at their usual spot, the old basketball court behind the school. He was already there, his laptop open and his fingers flying across the keyboard as he prepared for the task at hand. "So, what's the plan?" Leo asked, looking up from his laptop. "I need you to help me break into Langley's office," Hannah said bluntly. "I need to find the proof that he's the one who framed my dad. Do you think you can help?" Leo raised an eyebrow, then smirked. "Breaking and entering? My kind of afternoon." Hannah smiled, relieved. She knew Leo was always up for a challenge, and this was no exception. "I'll do my part," Leo said, "but you'll have to do the sneaking around. I'm not good at being subtle." Hannah nodded. She had been practicing for weeks, gathering information, memorizing floor plans, and keeping track of Langley's movements. She knew when he would be out of the office, when the security was least likely to be paying attention. The time had come to make her move. That night, as the office building's lights dimmed and employees left for the day, Hannah and Leo slipped into the building unnoticed. They had practiced their plan over and over. Leo would handle the tech side of things, hacking into Langley's computer and unlocking the files they needed. Meanwhile, Hannah would be the one to navigate the maze of hallways and offices, quietly searching for anything that could help her father. The building was eerily quiet as they made their way to Langley's office on the 18th floor. The air was thick with tension, and Hannah's heart raced as she tried to stay calm. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but the hallways were empty, save for the occasional janitor pushing a cart. When they reached Langley's office, Leo got to work, pulling out his small portable device. He connected it to the computer, typing furiously as he bypassed the security system. 5 minutes, Leo muttered, "and we'll be in." Hannah nodded, taking a deep breath. Her eyes scanned the office, her gaze landing on the row of filing cabinets in the corner. She moved quickly, but quietly, pulling open the drawers one by one. She knew that if she could find any physical evidence, documents or files, that tied Langley to the fraud, it would be the smoking gun she needed to prove her father's innocence. As Hannah rifled through the files, she heard a soft beep from Leo's device. "We're in," Leo whispered. "Go check the computer while I look through the physical files. We need everything." Hannah didn't hesitate. She walked over to Langley's desk, quickly searching through the open files on his computer. Most of the documents were financial records, nothing unusual at first glance. But then, one document caught her eye. It was labeled Confidential 2018 Fraud Case, and it had a file number that matched the year her father had been arrested. Her heart skipped a beat. Hannah clicked the file open, her eyes scanning the screen. What she saw made her stomach drop. The document was a report detailing the fraudulent transactions that had been traced back to GreenTech Industries. There were notes about false documentation, signatures that didn't match, and a name that stood out: Matthew Langley. It was the evidence she had been searching for, the proof that Langley was the one behind the fraud. The report even mentioned the plan to shift the blame to her father, framing him for a crime he didn't commit. Before she could take a closer look, a loud noise from the hallway made her freeze. Hannah's blood ran cold. Footsteps. Someone was coming. "Leo," she whispered urgently. "We need to go, now." Leo quickly shut down the laptop and grabbed his bag. "Let's move," he said, his voice low but urgent. Hannah didn't waste any time. She ran for the door, glancing back once to see if anyone had noticed them. The hallway was still empty, but the footsteps were getting closer. They rushed toward the back exit of the building, hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the stairwell, the door suddenly swung open, and 2 security guards stepped into the hallway. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "Run!" Leo shouted. They bolted down the stairs, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They could hear the guards shouting behind them, but they didn't stop. They had to get out of there before they were caught. With one final burst of speed, they made it to the street and ducked behind a dumpster, gasping for air. Hannah's heart was still racing as she clutched the file tightly in her hands. They had done it. They had found the evidence. But they weren't out of danger yet. Hannah's heart was pounding in her chest as she crouched behind the dumpster, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She could hear the distant sound of sirens wailing and the echoing footfalls of security guards searching the building. But she didn't care about the chase anymore. She had what she came for: proof that Matthew Langley was behind the fraud that had ruined her father's life. The file, still clutched tightly in her hand, felt like a heavy weight that was both a burden and a lifeline. The truth was finally within her reach. But as she looked at Leo, his face pale and tense, Hannah knew that escaping from the building was only the beginning. Langley and his people weren't going to let this go. They would stop at nothing to cover up their tracks. And now they knew someone was after them. "Let's go," Leo whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We've got to move. They'll be looking for us any minute." Hannah nodded, her mind racing. They had to get out of the area before anyone saw them. The last thing she wanted was for Langley's goons to catch up with them before they could get the file to someone who could expose the truth. She looked down at the file one last time before slipping it into her backpack. "Do you think they'll find us?" Hannah asked, her voice filled with concern. Leo glanced around, his eyes scanning the empty street. "They might, but if we keep moving and stay low, we can make it back to my place. No one will find us there." They began to move, sticking to the shadows and walking briskly down the alley. The city was bustling with activity, but the darkened streets seemed empty, like a labyrinth that hid them from view. Hannah's nerves were on edge as they turned corners and weaved through narrow streets, trying to keep as many obstacles between them and the people who would be hunting them down. It wasn't until they reached a quieter part of town that the sense of dread truly set in. They were nearly back to Leo's place when they heard it, the sound of footsteps, swift and heavy, following them from behind. "Leo, they're getting closer," Hannah whispered, her stomach sinking. "They found us." Leo's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist and pulling her down into an alley. They crouched behind a stack of crates, trying to control their breathing. The footsteps grew louder, and soon they could hear the voices of men speaking in hushed tones. "I think they went this way," one of them muttered. Hannah's blood ran cold. The voices were unmistakable. Langley's men. They were closing in. "We can't stay here," Leo hissed, his face tight with fear. "We need to get out of here. Now." Just as he finished speaking, the alley's entrance was blocked by a tall figure, one of Langley's enforcers, a man with a shaved head and dark sunglasses. He was scanning the alley, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Hannah held her breath, praying he wouldn't see them. "We've got to move. Fast," Leo whispered, his hand tightening around the strap of his bag. Hannah nodded, and they stood up, trying to move as silently as possible. They didn't have much time. Just then, Leo grabbed Hannah's hand and tugged her forward. "This way." They darted down the alley, running as fast as they could, but the sound of footsteps was right behind them. Hannah's chest burned with every breath, and she could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears. Leo was leading the way, but they were too close to being caught. Suddenly, Leo veered to the right, pushing open a small door at the end of the alley. They tumbled into a narrow, dimly lit hallway that smelled of damp concrete. They barely had time to take a breath before the door slammed shut behind them, and they heard the sound of footsteps coming down the alley. The men were following them. "We've got to get to the street, but not that way," Leo muttered, looking around frantically. "There's another exit, through the building's back door." Hannah nodded, and the two of them moved quickly down the hallway, trying to keep as quiet as possible. They reached the back door of the building and peeked outside. The street was quiet, but they knew they couldn't risk being seen. They needed a distraction. "That dumpster over there," Leo whispered, pointing to a metal bin at the corner of the street. "If we knock it over, it'll make a noise. It'll distract them just long enough for us to slip away." Hannah nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had to do this now. "On three," Leo said. Hannah took a deep breath, steadying herself. 1, 2, 3. With a forceful shove, Leo sent the dumpster toppling over, the metal clanging loudly as it hit the pavement. The sound echoed down the street, and the two of them took the opportunity to dart out of the building, running as fast as they could. They didn't stop. They didn't look back. As they reached the street, Leo grabbed Hannah's wrist, pulling her toward a crowded intersection. They joined the flow of people, hoping to blend in with the crowd and lose their pursuers. Their breath came in gasps, their bodies aching from the chase, but they didn't stop. Not until they reached a quiet street a few blocks away, far from the building and the people who were hunting them. "That was close," Hannah said, still breathless. "I didn't think we were going to make it." "We did," Leo replied, his voice filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "But this isn't over yet. We need to get the file to someone who can actually help us before Langley's people catch up with us again." Hannah looked at Leo, her eyes full of determination. "We're going to get this to the right person. We have to. My dad's life depends on it." With the file safe in her hands and her resolve stronger than ever, Hannah knew that the fight wasn't over. But now, they had the proof. They had the evidence. All they had to do was get it to the right people, and bring Matthew Langley and those who were helping him to justice. The adrenaline from the chase still surged through Hannah's veins as she and Leo made their way through the dimly lit streets. The night felt heavier now, the weight of their discovery pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder every few steps, half expecting Langley's men to be lurking around the corner, waiting to catch up. But for the moment, they were safe. The file was tucked securely in Hannah's backpack, and she could feel its significance. The truth, the evidence that could bring her father's freedom. "We need to get this to someone who can actually make a difference," Leo said, his voice urgent. "Someone who can use it to expose Langley and the whole operation." Hannah nodded, her thoughts racing. She knew exactly who they needed to see. The only person who had the resources and platform to bring this to light was Becky Moore, a respected investigative journalist who had covered high-profile cases of corporate corruption in the past. She had the kind of pull that could get this story in front of the right people. The problem? Finding her without being caught by Langley's men. "Becky's the one," Hannah said, determination in her voice. "She's the only one who can help us get the truth out there. She'll know what to do." Leo glanced around, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. "Okay, but we need to be careful. If Langley knows we have the file, they'll be hunting for us, and for Becky. We can't risk leading them straight to her." "Right," Hannah replied, her mind already working on a plan. "We'll meet her in person. She won't be expecting us to come to her directly. We'll use her contacts, make sure no one's following us." They quickened their pace, heading toward an old bookstore where Becky had once told them she worked on certain days when she wasn't traveling or chasing a story. It wasn't the most obvious place, but that was exactly why it would work. By the time they reached the bookstore, it was already late, and the streets were quieter. The old building stood in the shadows, its windows dim, casting a dark reflection of the city lights. They took a deep breath before heading inside, the bell above the door ringing softly as they entered. The store smelled of dust and old paper, the scent of something long forgotten. It was exactly the kind of place Hannah imagined someone like Becky Moore would work, a safe house for secrets and stories that needed to be told. They made their way to the back of the store, where a small office area was hidden behind a bookshelf that had clearly seen better days. When they knocked, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with sharp green eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Becky Moore. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she looked every bit the part of an investigative journalist who had spent her life digging into the darkest corners of corporate corruption. "You two have guts. I'll give you that," Becky said, her voice low but steady as she ushered them inside. "You know they'll be looking for you. The question is, what took you so long to come to me?" Hannah didn't waste any time. She pulled the file out of her backpack and placed it on the desk in front of Becky. "We have everything you need to bring down GreenTech Industries and clear my father's name," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves that still lingered. Becky's eyes flicked over the file, her sharp mind already processing the gravity of the situation. She didn't need to ask what was inside. She knew this was the real deal. The corruption, the fraud, the conspiracy to frame an innocent man, it was all in the file. She sat down, glancing up at Hannah and Leo. "You two didn't just walk in here with a piece of paper. You know what you've got, don't you?" Hannah nodded, swallowing hard. "I do. And so does my dad. He didn't do this. But if Langley, if GreenTech, gets away with this, it's going to ruin everything. They're covering their tracks. They've framed him. And now they know we have this. They'll stop at nothing to silence us." Becky leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk. "So, what's your plan? You're going to hand me this, and I'm supposed to wave a magic wand and make everything right? It's not that easy." "I know," Hannah said, meeting Becky's gaze. "But you're the only one who can expose this. You have the resources. You have the connections. This file proves Langley's involvement in the fraud, and it links him to my father's arrest. You just need to make sure it doesn't get buried." Becky didn't respond immediately. She opened the file and started scanning through the contents, her expression unreadable. A few moments passed before she spoke again. "Okay, you're right," she said quietly. "This is the kind of story that could take down a company like GreenTech. But if I expose this, there's going to be fallout. This goes way beyond your dad. We're talking about some very powerful people. Langley isn't just a businessman. He's tied in with some pretty dangerous people." Hannah felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean? How bad is it?" Becky paused, looking at them both. "Let's just say Langley isn't someone who just plays with money and paperwork. If he's involved in this, it's deeper than you can imagine. The people he's working with, they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Leo looked worried. "So, what do we do?" Becky stood up, her expression firm. "We get this to the public, but we do it smart. I'll use my contacts to get the information in the right hands. People who can't be intimidated, who can't be bought. But first, you two need to get as far away from this place as possible. Langley's people won't stop until they find out who's behind this. And right now, that's you." Hannah's heart raced as she looked at Leo. The risk was higher than ever, but they had no choice. They had to expose Langley and his network, no matter what the cost. "Be careful," Becky said, glancing at the file one last time. "Once this goes public, there's no turning back." "Just get it out there," Hannah replied, her voice unwavering. "We've already come this far. We're not stopping now." Hannah's heart was racing as she and Leo walked away from Becky Moore's office. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion, and yet, at the same time, everything was happening too fast. They had handed over the file to Becky, the evidence that could bring down GreenTech Industries and clear her father's name. But even as she thought they had finally done it, an unsettling feeling lingered in the pit of her stomach. Langley wasn't going to let this go. He and his people were powerful, and they would do whatever it took to protect themselves, to keep the truth from coming out. As they made their way down the quiet street, Leo kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We need to move quickly," he said quietly. "The moment Langley figures out we've gone to Becky, he'll know we've crossed the line. They'll be coming for us." "I know," Hannah replied, her voice tight. "But we can't stop now. Not when we're this close." Leo nodded. "We'll lay low for a while, stay under the radar. No one's going to suspect us if we keep moving and keep our heads down." But just as they rounded a corner, a black SUV pulled up to the curb in front of them, blocking their path. The door opened, and from it stepped Samuel Clark, the prosecutor who had been trying to convict Hannah's father from the very beginning. He was flanked by two men in suits, both of them looking as cold and menacing as Clark himself. "Well, well," Clark said, his voice dripping with disdain. "It looks like the little girl finally found her voice." Hannah's stomach dropped. They had been found. Langley's people had tracked them down, and now they were cornered. There was nowhere to run. Leo stepped in front of her instinctively, but Hannah could see the fear in his eyes. Clark and his men were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to use force to stop her. She didn't want to think about what they might do to silence her, to silence the truth. "You really think you can expose GreenTech?" Clark continued, his voice low and mocking. "You think you've found something they can't cover up? You have no idea what you're dealing with, girl. You've just made a very big mistake." Hannah's mind raced, her thoughts scattered as she tried to think of a way out. Her eyes flicked to Leo's face. He was searching for an escape too. They needed a distraction, something to get them out of here before Langley's men caught them. "You're right about one thing," Hannah said, standing tall despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I might not know everything, but I know enough to take you down. You and Langley, you're going to be exposed for everything you've done. And there's nothing you can do to stop it." Clark's face darkened. "You don't understand. This isn't just about your father anymore. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than all of us." "Then why are you so afraid of the truth?" Hannah shot back. "If there's nothing to hide, then why are you out here chasing a 10-year-old girl? You're afraid, Clark. You're afraid of what we know." For a moment, Clark's eyes flashed with something close to panic. He stepped forward, his men closing in on them, their hands hovering near their weapons. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind frantically searching for an opening. She had to do something, anything, to throw them off. She couldn't let them take her down without a fight. "Leo," she whispered, barely audible. "Do you have the drive?" Leo's eyes widened. "You're not thinking of—" Before he could finish, Hannah grabbed the flash drive from her backpack. She held it up, the small piece of plastic gleaming in the dim light. "You're not taking us down," Hannah said, her voice trembling but full of determination. "Not today." Clark's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, his hand reaching out. "Give it to me, now." But Hannah was already a step ahead. She turned and tossed the flash drive into the air, sending it high up and out of reach. The men lunged to grab it, but it was too late. As it landed, the flash drive rolled into a narrow gap in the sidewalk, wedged between two bricks. "Nice try," Clark sneered, "but you can't run forever." Hannah felt a rush of adrenaline. She knew they couldn't stay there much longer. Leo had already grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the alley, but Clark's men were fast. Too fast. "We need to go! Now!" Leo shouted, as they sprinted down the alley, hearts racing, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind them. The alley was narrow, and the buildings on either side seemed to close in around them as they raced towards the street. There was no time to look back. They had to keep moving. As they reached the street, they saw the familiar shape of a bus pulling up to the stop, its doors opening. It was their only chance. Without thinking, Hannah grabbed Leo's arm and pulled him toward the bus. The doors were closing, but they made it just in time. The moment they stepped onto the bus, the doors slammed shut behind them, and the vehicle lurched forward, carrying them away from the danger. The bus took them through the streets, and as they rode in silence, Hannah's mind was spinning. They had escaped, but the war wasn't over. Langley and his people would keep coming after them, keep trying to silence the truth. But now, they had the upper hand. The flash drive was safe. The evidence was still in their hands, and there was no going back. Hannah sat silently in the back of the bus, the hum of the engine barely registering as her mind replayed everything that had just happened. Her hands still trembled from the adrenaline, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She glanced at Leo, who was sitting next to her, his expression tense, his eyes darting to the windows, still on high alert. They had made it. For now. But they both knew that this wasn't over. Langley and his people wouldn't stop until they found out who had the evidence, and when they did, they would stop at nothing to get it back. They were both exhausted, their minds and bodies pushed to the limit. But Hannah knew one thing for certain. They had the truth, and they weren't going to let anyone take that away from them. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Leo said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. "You're a legend. You know that, right?" Hannah gave a faint smile. "I don't feel like one." Leo grinned. "Well, you are. Who else would break into an office, outrun armed security, and then get the biggest corporate fraud case of the year into the hands of the right people?" "I didn't do it alone," Hannah replied. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Leo shrugged, but there was a proud glint in his eye. "Well, you found the truth. I just helped you get it where it needed to go." Hannah nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the file they had handed off to Becky Moore, the investigative journalist who would help them expose the corruption at GreenTech Industries. There was no turning back now. Becky was already setting things in motion. The file had been securely passed to her, and she had promised to get it into the hands of the right people. The truth was going to come out, and Langley and his accomplices would be held accountable. But there was still one thing left to do. As the bus pulled to a stop, Hannah and Leo made their way off and walked toward the nearest train station. They needed to lay low for a while. Becky had warned them that there would be fallout. Powerful people would do whatever it took to silence them. They couldn't take any chances now. Hannah was just about to step onto the platform when her phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket and saw a message from Becky Moore. "The story's already out. It's everywhere. Langley and his crew are done. The world knows the truth." Hannah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The first step had been taken. The truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was out in the open for everyone to see. But the victory didn't feel like a win yet. Langley and his associates were still out there, and they had a long road ahead of them. Then came the news that made her heart soar. Another message from Becky popped up. Breaking. Judge Michael Hartman, the presiding judge in the GreenTech fraud case, has been arrested in connection with the conspiracy to frame David Green. The investigation is ongoing. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Her father's name had been cleared, but it was bigger than that. The very judge who had been overseeing the case, Judge Hartman, the one who had reacted so strangely when Hannah presented the letter, was now implicated in the conspiracy. He had been involved. He had been part of the cover-up. And now, the entire operation was starting to unravel. "They did it," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're really going down." Leo looked at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. "We really did it. We exposed them all.